Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel on Brexit. How long does this carry on? Moderated by Financial Times U.S. business editor Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson.
All right, thank you very much. Milken is all about finding uplifting solutions to the world's problems, so I'm not quite sure what we're doing here, but I salute all of you for coming. I've spent the last 3 years hiding in the FT's New York office trying to avoid talking about Brexit, but here we are, and I'm delighted that you are here for it. And I think, in all seriousness, our challenge on this panel is to discover whether there are some uplifting solutions to the predicament that Britain finds itself in right now. So almost 3 years from the close referendum vote in 2016, Britain has yet to leave the European Union. Parliament's been unable to agree on how to do it or whether to ask the country even to vote again. Internationally, Britain's place in the world has come into question. Closer to home, the clock is ticking on the Prime Minister. The two major parties are splintering, and patience among voters in Brussels and in business is wearing thin. We have a packed calendar coming up politically in Britain. We have local elections on May the 2nd, European elections at the end of the month, May 23rd, and a twice-delayed Article 50 deadline now on Halloween, October the 31st. So there are big unresolved questions about what happens between now and October 31st, and even bigger questions probably about what happens in terms of Britain's place in the world, the impact on business and others, and finance beyond that. So the challenge, I think, for us up here is in all the noise about this process, what should outsiders be paying attention to? And I suspect many of you have not been waking up every morning to the Today programme and going to sleep every night to Newsnight and steeped in the minutiae of Article 50. But I suspect you also have something at stake in the outcome. So to discuss this, we have an experienced panel reflecting views across the spectrum, Conservative and Labour, Leave and Remain, financial services and foreign policy. I'll do very brief introductions. We have on my far left Howard Shaw, Executive Chairman of Shaw Capital Group, who was a backer of the Leave campaign. To his right, Hugh Powell, former UK Deputy National Security Advisor under David Cameron. Baroness Kingsmill, a Labour peer in the House of Lords, former Deputy Chair of the Competition Commission and a long-term antitrust lawyer with 20 years' experience on boards of various stripes. Joe Johnson, I need to introduce with a minor disclaimer in that Joe and I have shared a few bylines in a past life that he probably would rather forget about, working for the Financial Times, but he will remember the FT motto that we are without fear or favour. Joe is now Conservative MP for Orpington. He served in several ministerial roles, most recently as Minister for Transport, a position he resigned from in Theresa May's government last year. We can get into that in more detail. And finally, Lord Falconer, who's a partner in Gibson, Dunn, former Lord Chancellor under Tony Blair. I'm going to start off with a lightning round, just so you all understand where people started from, and simply ask the panelists from left to right, one-word answer, which way did you vote in 2016, Leave or Remain? Howard?
Leave.
Remain.
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 Okay. Would any of you vote differently given the chance to do that again?
I wouldn't vote differently given the chance again, but we lost. We've got to accept it. I think part of the problem that Britain is experiencing at the moment is a refusal to accept the result. So we can't decide in Britain whether we're trying to leave on the best terms or whether we're fighting to avoid leaving.
I would not change my view. I would continue to remain. I don't agree with Charlie on this one. I think there were a lot of lies told at the time. I think that people know an enormous amount more about exactly what Brexit involves, which they didn't at the time that the referendum took place, which was in itself an act of political expediency on the part of David Cameron, who probably, until Mrs. May, was the weakest Prime Minister we ever had. And I think it's an act of political and economic suicide on behalf of the UK.
Howard, I'm guessing you disagree.
Yeah, I've got my bulletproof vest on here.
Got my what?
I agree with Charlie that at the end of the day there was a vote and we need to implement it. I mean, this idea that there were lies on one side and not on the other. Of course, in any election campaign, there's strong arguments made, propaganda, false claims. The Remainers, I'll remind you, had the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the head of the IMF, the Governor of the Bank of England, the President of the United States of America, and others on their side. And the British public were being told that the economy might drop off the edge of a cliff, and they, despite that, voted Brexit. So I'll just leave that thought with you.
All right. Hugh, and I'm going to ask this question to several of you, but how did we get where we are today? You know, as I said, we haven't resolved this almost 3 years on from the vote. And I know the vote was close, but why is Britain still stuck?
So I'll leave it to the others to do the, how should I put it, the more political big picture stuff. I approach this like a sort of, from the point of view of one of my former roles in life, as sort of first secretary political in an embassy. And if I was in the US Embassy in London, writing a telegram analyzing this for the State Department and White House, I would be making the point that Theresa May could by now have scraped enough votes for her deal if it wasn't for two things. First of all, allowing the illusion of a no-deal option to continue for so long. I think any analyst just looking at the arithmetic of the Commons could have told you 2 years ago that this was never going to be allowed. And secondly, it's the Irish backstop mechanism. Now, I don't want to take people down the rabbit hole of all the details of the Irish border question, but it is essentially a side issue on the fundamental question of Brexit and the future relationship with Europe. And quite how both the British government but also the EU allowed itself to get into this dead end of a sort of really purist legalistic approach to the mechanism on this is a bit of a mystery to me. And indeed, if I was Angela Merkel's foreign policy advisor, I would be thinking that, gosh, we missed a trick here. We really should have intervened a lot earlier to stop the EU and the Irish getting us hung up on a position where the thing most likely to cause a hard border is our own position on how to avoid a hard border.
Well, I think we want to go into more detail probably on both of those points shortly. But Joe, you've written in the FT that you woke up the morning after the referendum, which did not go the way that you'd hoped, and said, let's make the best of it. Do you feel we have?
Yeah, I felt an obligation to try and respect the result and to deliver a Brexit that would be in the national interest. What ensued over the following months was it became increasingly clear that we were not going to be able to deliver a Brexit that was better than the status quo, either in terms of how our economy would grow over a reasonable time frame, or in terms of how our own sovereign control over our domestic affairs would increase or decrease. It was clear to me we were going to end up being poorer and less in control than we presently were. So on that basis, I had to sort of stop suspending disbelief. Having campaigned for Remain, I was always pretty skeptical, but when the result came in, I decided, okay, let's give it a go, let's try and make it work. And for the following 18 months, I was a member of the government and did my bit to try and deliver on a deal that would be in the national interest. But I think we have not succeeded in that. And the fact is, Parliament has rejected the Prime Minister's attempt to craft a Brexit that's in the national interest 3 times now. Brexit's been delayed twice already, as you know, and the project really feels like it's lost momentum and has pretty much stalled. So what you see now in the UK is highly unusual for Britain as a country, where we are literally flailing around for ideas as to how we can break this impasse. And I think the reality is there is no one in the country who knows how this is going to unfold. Certainly I don't, and I'm not sure anybody on this panel can tell you with any certainty that they know what's going to happen at the end of the next fortnight. And for Britain, that's an extraordinary state of affairs. We're a country which is known for being pragmatic and stable and pretty resilient, and you're really seeing us in a very unusual position.
We're also known for Benny Hill, but to be fair. Howard, do you agree with that idea that Brexit has lost momentum? That, you know, among people who've always believed in this project, do you feel there's any loss of faith in it?
Yes, but you know, like anything, it's always in the execution. If you have a big change, this is a seminal change which is going to affect British life for decades to come. We should not measure it in terms of whether it's caused any level of disruption over the last few months. And by the way, just to contextualize that, the GDP forecast for the UK for 2019 is approximately the same as France and above Germany. So despite the disruption, you know, the economic performance, which has been impacted, certainly not off the edge of a cliff. But when you make a change like this, it's going to have adverse short-term consequences, and it's going to be difficult to implement, but you do it because you think it's going to be better for the next generation and the generation after that. But any change that you make is only as good as the way it's implemented, and that's all about execution. We have the worst leader in the UK in living memory. She's incompetent, incapable. I said it at the beginning. She's out of her depth, and she doesn't take advice from people who've ever had experience in negotiations. Where I disagree with what was said in the panel is that it's not possible to craft a deal which would gain support. And I'm afraid it is essential when you go into a business negotiation. And unfortunately, this is all about business. It's about interests. And the Europeans want to protect their market. They want to keep us in the customs union. They want to keep regulatory alignment, and they want to keep selling their goods to the UK. They don't want us to have a different set of regulations. They don't want us to prove that a deregulated Britain can do better. But on the other hand, they want some money from us, and they want to keep selling those goods to our markets freely. So what are the cards that we can play in a negotiation? Well, it's two things, really. It's not just money, which she's offered prior to a trade deal, which is absurd, but it's actually access. Because what they're talking about is prohibiting access to their markets in services by saying that if we leave, we're not part of the single market, and we're not part of the single market because we don't have freedom of movement of people, therefore we can't sell our services. Well, if you're in a business negotiation, you say, hold on a moment, you've got 100 billion a year surplus, you're freely selling your goods to our markets, but you're telling me you're going to cut your markets off from what we're good at, and you want 40 billion quid from us? That's not a business deal. So if you had someone who had any business experience and strength and conviction, they could have delivered a different deal. Coming to the Irish border point, it was always clear at the beginning that that would be a contentious issue. It was obviously made much more contentious when Varadkar became Irish leader, and the EU officials jumped on all this, and I entirely agree that the Germans should have stepped in earlier.
Paranoid.
But I do believe the export industry of Germany is now putting pressure on the Germans to start leaning on the Irish. So
okay,
things will change.
I'll be interested to hear a response to that. But first of all, I'm disappointed you held back on your views on Theresa May and hear what you really thought here. But Lord Falconer, do you agree that does Britain have cards to play still in this negotiation?
I do think we've got cards to play, but I don't think the problem is the negotiation. Because a deal has been done by Mrs. May, which is a moderately predictable deal, which doesn't really go into the future trading relationship, because it's basically a deal to facilitate our exit. I think Howard expresses the crazed paranoia of the Leave people. What is going on at the moment, I think, is primarily driven by the politics of the United Kingdom. And the politicians most certainly never expected this to happen. The politicians, some of whom argued strongly for leave, have been very surprised by their lack of ability either to judge or persuade the public. And their lack of confidence was then underlined by the extraordinary result in 2017 in the general election, where again the politicians completely failed to judge the mood of the British people. The British people, instead of giving Joe's party, led by the estimable Mrs. May, a massive majority, sort of said, oh, we're not sure about anything, and ended up giving nobody a majority. So we've got a political group running the country in the UK that have no confidence and are unprepared. It's like as if President Trump had won the presidential election in 2016 and the country, America, had to be governed as Trump would govern it, except Hillary Clinton was the president. So what you've got in Britain is you've got this inexplicable, as the politicians see it, leave vote, completely unexpected. They've got to govern in the shadow of this vote, and they're not quite sure how to do it. Now, I am a great admirer of Mrs. May, personally. She's a brave, determined, splendiferously decent person. She probably was the least equipped politician I know to lead the United Kingdom at this particular moment. So we've got unprepared politicians, unsure about why it happened, with no plan provided for them by the civil service, led by a person of great personal decency who is peculiarly unsuited to be a politician, let alone to be the politician leading the United Kingdom out. But I think we understand as a group, this is the politicians, that we have to leave the European Union or the politics of our country will become horribly ugly and unmanageable. So I'm sure we'll discuss later on how we get out of this mess, but get out of this mess, I am sure we will.
Okay. Joe, as a member of the political class, do you agree it's a failure of the political class?
Well, look, I think there were problems with the negotiation, how it began. I mean, there was certainly a mistake to start the 2-year clock ticking before we'd established as a government that we had a framework for a deal that would command support across Parliament. At the moment, we don't even have a deal that commands support within a Conservative cabinet, within the Conservative party within Parliament, and we certainly don't have one that can achieve a sustainable consensus across parliaments within Parliament itself. So that was a tactical mistake, certainly, but I don't think that was the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem was there is no precedent anywhere in the world ever for an advanced country, an advanced economy, withdrawing from a trading arrangement as deep and as complex as the EU is. No country has attempted it because it involves reimposing barriers to trade, regulatory barriers, potentially tariff barriers and quotas, which we've spent decades removing. And we've been one of the great proponents, great advocates of the single market over the years, and it's not surprising that Parliament has struggled to come up with support for a deal which is, in my view, manifestly worse than our present arrangements as full members of the European Union.
But we haven't I agree with all of what you say about the difficulties in relation to it, but we haven't really got to the bit where we're asking ourselves the detailed questions about how do we deal with re-erecting tariff barriers. I think that is an unlikely outcome in relation to this, because whatever deal we do, I suspect the Europeans are not going to impose tariff barriers, nor us to them. But that's not what's causing the problem at the moment.
Well, it isn't, Charlie, because the deal which Parliament is being asked to vote on, as everybody in this room may or may not know, It has two parts to it. The first part is the so-called withdrawal agreement, which is the settlement of our accounts with the EU, the dues that we owe as a member over the past period of time, the rights of EU nationals in the UK and UK nationals in the rest of the EU, and the resolution of how the Northern Ireland border is going to work. That's the withdrawal agreement. It's essentially backward-looking. There is, however, something attached to it called the political declaration, which foreshadows the future relationship, the future trade relationship that the UK will have with the EU. And that sets out the starting point for Britain's negotiating position. And that sets out quite clearly that Britain is going to accept a subordinate level of access to the single market than we presently enjoy. And to me, that's exceedingly problematic.
But Joe, can I just ask, why would you possibly...
Listen, I'm sorry, I'm just going to quickly answer the point. The question is, how long does this carry on? And Joe makes a very, very interesting point. This is the starting point. This is a starting point. If we, even if we achieve a deal, okay, and I personally would much prefer to say that we're going to revoke Article 50, we're going to stay put, we're going to take a deep breath, think again, and see what the future is. That's what my personal view is. I think it's an unlikely scenario, but it's what I would like to see happen. Assuming some sort of a deal gets done, it is simply the starting point. There will be years and years of negotiations to work out exactly how we are going to leave. I have been involved in the minutiae, as a lawyer, of the minutiae of the regulatory connections that we have had, the statutory instruments which have held us together for the last 40 years, that have been incrementally increased over the last 40 years, and which breaking apart is technically an incredibly difficult issue. And I've been doing that pretty solidly for the last 6 weeks, apart from anything else. It should have been for the last 2 years if we were serious about leaving, but instead of which we have about 600 pieces of legislation that we have got to get through. And I actually want to take Hugh up on the point about the backstop, the Irish backstop. This is very, very important. This is a piece of legislation, an international agreement for peace in Northern Ireland, and that is a vital, vital issue which Brexit, which Westminster has simply dismissed as being the Irish are being difficult again. It is terribly important that we sustain that. There's already been rumblings on the border about a renewal of difficulties there, and that would be the most horrendous step. And Brexit risks that. There's one final point I want to make while I've got the floor before.
All these men
before the guys get in.
Yeah.
And that is, there is a serious risk if we leave the European Union that our union, that the United Kingdom will break up. That already the Scots are exploring having conversations because they are resolutely against leaving Europe. The Scots have got an independent parliament. They are having conversations and negotiations about joining or indeed they'd have to rejoin the EU, and the EU would be delighted to have them. And smaller countries than Scotland belong to the EU. There is the 12 counties which represent Northern Ireland, which is that little section that isn't ERA, that isn't Ireland, if you like, that belongs to Britain. They're already talking about what a united Ireland would look like. And I confidently predict that if we do leave the European Union, we could see a breakup of the United Kingdom, leaving a rump of just England and Wales, with Scotland and Ireland off.
Howard, have you unleashed the breakup of Britain?
Sorry?
Have you unleashed the breakup of Britain?
It's a serious, serious risk.
Look, first of all, let's just analyse the Irish border issue.
Oh, no.
There's only four possible. There's only actually four possible solutions.
Oh no, 4.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, nothing.
I'm sure we can solve the Irish.
I was simply,
border issue.
I mean, having lived for 3 years with Brexit, to hear somebody say there are 4 possible solutions to the Irish, one's heart sinks, I can tell you.
And I'm the paranoid person? There's 4 possible serious outcomes which could have been on the table, and 2 are obviously not going to be acceptable in terms of customs. So one is that you have a border between Ireland and the rest of the EU. Irish say no to that. The second is you have a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. That's out as well. The third is you stay in the customs union, okay? And the fourth is that you have a different set of arrangements between Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, in order to try and administer customs in the most seamless way possible using technology. Now, trade between Ireland, Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland, I'd love to know whether people on the panel know how much that is.
I don't.
I don't think it's a question of value, frankly.
Okay.
It's a question of,
Well,
who
you had the
belongs
floor.
where. It's a question of identity.
It was a rhetorical question. It's 3 billion. It's
Why
three,
did you pause then for an answer?
It's three. I told you, this is exactly what always happens in a Brexit debate.
Yes.
Whenever anybody has a different view to the political establishment, they get attacked.
I have to say,
we have a 3 billion. We have a 3
Did
billion.
I not say paranoid?
we have a 3 billion. We have a 3 billion trade between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. 90% of the traffic between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland is conducted by 50 firms. So of that 3 billion, 2.7 billion is conducted by 50 firms who have lorries. It's quite easy to track those lorries electronically. So we're remaining 300 million of trade. How much of that trade does anyone here think is likely to be smuggled backwards and forwards across the border? Are we talking about 10 million, 20 million, 50 million, 100 million? Are you telling me that the EU don't want to do a deal because they're worried about customs smuggling to the tune of 50 or 100 million, which, by the way, probably happens between Switzerland and the rest of Europe on an annual basis and more?
So
this is about the EU grasping an issue which Irish Prime Minister escalated over customs and trying to control the British economy by keeping us in a regulatory alignment called the Customs Union. And they think it's in their economic interest to keep us in that customs union as long as possible because they have 100 billion a year surplus.
All right, Hugh, I've got to bring you in here. As First Secretary Political in the American Embassy, would you be worrying about exactly how many million are being smuggled across an Irish border, or would you be worrying about the sanctity of the Good Friday Agreement and about something bigger than that?
Well, we seem to have sort of gone into that, again, classic for a Brexit debate. People are going straight to what they think should happen as opposed to what is the realistic art of the possible given the differing views and the parliamentary arithmetic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, can I just ask you, I mean, are we still on the how do we get out of this mess question, or are we now on the sort of
the mess even?
Okay, perhaps the question I'll tackle is if I was American and looking at this from American interests point of view, what would I be now focusing on? Shall I tackle that?
Yes.
Okay, so back as First Secretary Political at the Embassy in the Court of St. James, I would be focusing on two things from an American point of view. First, Macron. Second, the Tory party leadership election. Macron, because I think the chances of ending up with a no-deal Brexit are much lower than the commentariat currently would have you believe, but they are not negligible. And the thing most likely to cause no-deal Brexit is the current French president doing a de Gaulle and effectively using his power of veto to, in a sense, force the issue. Now, I think it's imaginable because you can construct an argument that makes it in France's interest to have that outcome. I think it's unlikely because, I mean, it really would, I think, alienate most of Europe if he were to do it, and it is very difficult to see how a French president could persuade himself that he could actually effectively pursue for the next 4 years his objectives in Europe, get people talking about the French agenda, having done this. But I would be sort of, if I was American, really focusing on how Macron is likely to play his hand. And indeed, I'd be, if I was in the White House, I'd be asking myself whether and how I might influence that. The second issue is the Tory party leadership, because from certainly an American government point of view, and frankly from most American businesses' point of view, Brexit pales in comparison in terms of potential impact compared to the potential impact of the next UK election. And this crosses not just economic policy and companies operating in the UK, but the entire sort of international relations, national security sphere. And the thing most likely to shift the probabilities of that electoral outcome is if the Tory party splits. I mean, very difficult to see how you stop a Corbyn government, if that is what you want to do, if the Tory party is split. And who gets in as the next Tory party leader, how they handle the Brexit issue, and frankly what commitments they make to various wings of the party on that, is the thing most likely to determine whether the Tory party splits or not. So those would be my two big takeaways.
So I'm sure you'd like a question about the Tory party leadership election.
Well, I can come in on what Hugh was saying about the Tory party split. I mean, I think it is relevant to the US audience, because the split would go along the lines of the response to the question which is most fundamental to Brexit and which remains unanswered, and it's why we haven't been able to execute Brexit as a country, which is, do we want to stay aligned to the EU rules and regulations that give us full unfettered access to our biggest market, or do we want to choose a different mode of regulation that gives us complete control over our laws and our own affairs, that enables us to do deals with other countries around the world, including the US? So that's the fundamental choice which we haven't yet made as a country, and it's that trade-off between access to the EU's market, our biggest market, and control over our own laws and regulations. And until we make that choice, we won't be able to move forward. Now, as and when we do make that choice, there is a risk that the Conservative Party splits, because it's possible that there'll be a significant number of members of the Conservative Parliamentary Party who will not want to move to a regime whereby we can become a sort of what's characterized as a Singapore-on-Thames model, whereby we could be a low-tax, low-regulation economy competing on the edge of continental Europe and able to, buccaneer around the world. There is a significant risk of some MPs not being comfortable with that. On the other hand, if we stay closely aligned with European rules and regulations, there is an equally large and very vocal group of MPs on the right of the party who will say, no, this isn't what Brexit is all about. Brexit is all about sailing the wide open seas and reconnecting with countries around the world whom we've been kept artificially constrained from developing our economic relationships with by the constraints of the European Union.
So, Howard, you've been a Conservative Party donor over the years.
Yes.
Are you still, or are you going to be switching your money to a splittist party, something like the Brexit Party or some other?
Well, save for the Carlton dinner event, because I was a prior chairman, I haven't been supporting the Conservative Party financially since Theresa May became leader, because I thought she was the wrong leader.
You're right.
In my heart, I'm still a Conservative and want the Conservative Party to prosper. It's been around 200 years. But I will say that, a large section of traditional Conservative supporters are so frustrated that the party hasn't managed to get rid of her that they will show that protest vote in the EU elections, either by not voting or voting the Brexit Party.
So, Baroness Kingsmill, we've seen the emergence of these new parties. Brexit Party, we've got Change UK, made up of MPs who've broken away from the two major parties. How far do you think they can go? Does this really change the electoral mathematics in Britain?
Well, I hope so, in some senses, because one of the good things that have come out of Brexit is that some of the differences between the two major parties have melted away. I feel I have more in common with Joe, probably, than I do with my colleague from the Labour Party, in the sense that we share an approach to Brexit. We don't necessarily share an approach to many other things, but we do share an approach to Brexit. So there has been a breaking down. I mean, the UK Parliament sits 2 sword lengths apart I mean, 2 sword lengths apart. Just think about that. It is built on
newly relevant.
It's built on a two-party system where both sides fight like hell for their position, and that's what it is. And the one thing about Brexit is it has broken down some of those divisions. But what has also happened, it has allowed the rise, and I think it's a very healthy thing, the rise of other parties, the Green Party, the SNP. I'm not sure about the Change UK lot. They've got some funny people in there, but that's to be seen. We have to see how that one all works out. So in a way, yes. I mean, most of Europe have coalition governments. I think that's probably what the majority of people would like to see: more coalition and less strict division between the two.
Is that the logical outcome for a parliament that can't make up its mind about anything, for a voting base which is very narrowly split on the major issues?
I don't think that it is, and I think Joe knows much better than I what the Tory party and the MPs may do, but I don't think ultimately the Tory party is going to make a choice that we want to be Singapore on sea or not Singapore on sea.
We need a better airport.
I think that may well be right. I think what the Tory party will decide, like it's always decided in the past, is it's a bit of balance. You know, you need to give up a bit of access in order to get a bit of independence, and you need to give up a bit of independence to get a bit of access. That would traditionally be the way that the Tory party would deal with it. But I think Hugh is right when he says the key thing for the outside world is who's going to be the next government. And history sort of tells us that governments sort of lose their credibility and then can't regain it until after there's been a general election. Mrs. May did quite badly in 2017 before she had totally messed up her attempts to leave the European Union. What's happened to the Conservatives in the last 6 months to a year, I think, has pretty well ruined their chances of winning a general election whenever it comes. Just like John Major lost the general election because there was a hammering of the pound in 1992, just after he'd won it, and he hung on like a dead man waiting to be executed, which he duly was in 1997. So I think the Tories have lost the next election, and I think Hugh, when he is thinking as the first secretary in the embassy what's going to happen, I think everybody should be preparing for a Labour government, because the Tories are not really functioning anymore as a government. And this idea that they must wait for this historic choice is optimistic. And I mean, we all know there's going to be elections in 3 days' time in England. I'm not sure they'll be that significant in the local elections. I think the elections that follow, if they take place, then the European elections, they may not happen because a cross-party deal may be done, but if they do happen, they will reveal, I think, that large numbers of Tory voters have defected to the Brexit party, led by the personification of Brexit in the United Kingdom, Mr. Nigel Farage, and that will further unhinge the Conservative Party. I'm sure at that point they will go for Joe's brother or some other sort of crazed Brexiteer.
You have the right to...
That sounds like I'm going to be Prime Minister.
Joe's brother used to live in the very same part of London that I live in, which is Islington, which is sort of Trendsville personified. And Boris had a house there, which people would point out as being a house, and there'd be sort of groups of groupies hanging outside Boris's house until the 25th or 26th, what's the date of the referendum? 23rd?
June 2016, yeah.
June 23rd, whereupon the whole of Islington turned against Boris because he'd led the sort of successful campaign to leave. And then there were crowds of people booing.
This is getting a little personal now.
No, well, it's indicative of the fact that London has turned against Brexit big time, but maybe outside London, seeing the Londoners booing somebody like Boris equals something that makes him attractive.
Okay. I do want to just have one question about Labour and how Corbyn is playing this, because Labour is not exactly without its own internal divisions. Which of you? Who wants to take that? Hugh, do you want to take that?
Well, sorry, I just want to give me a second to respond to Lord Falconer on this, and try and reassure a predominantly American audience. I mean, there is a strong argument that the die is not absolutely cast, the way that Charlie just said. I mean, let's remember that until about 4 weeks ago, however split and incompetent the government looked, it was still well ahead in the opinion polls. Mm-hmm. Compared to what was it, Black Wednesday, and what happened to John Major, the choice facing the electorate is a lot more extreme next time. And if the Tory party can hold together, the next election is not for at least 3 years. So the die is not cast.
On that point, Hugh, the sense of Corbyn as an unacceptably left figure was a sense that existed well before the 2017 election, and he came within 2 to 3 percentage points of the Conservative in the popular vote. And the Conservatives are in a sort of geometrically worse position now than they were in 2017. I do think that where a party reveals itself to be, and this is not a party political point, you'll be very glad to hear, but where it reveals itself to be incapable of performing the most basic function of government, which is what the Conservative government has proved to be, it is very, very difficult to come back from that, even with a new leader.
Okay, so I mean, today we've had some news from the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn has resisted the Europhiles in his own party and not committed to a second referendum in the Labour manifesto, but has left that option open if other alternatives fail. Can you explain to this audience how Corbyn is playing this process?
Well, any Labour leader, whether it have been Tony Blair or Jeremy Corbyn, would have great difficulty in leading the Labour Party during this period, because maybe 2/3 of the voters are Remainers, 1/3 are Leavers. If Labour lose those 1/3 Leavers, they will lose great tranches of seats and may never get government. So any leader sensibly has got to keep on trying to appeal to both of them. The significance of what happened today in London is that Jeremy and the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party have said, we don't necessarily need to have a second referendum in order to support any deal that may come out of the cross-party talks that are going on between Labour and the Conservatives to see if there is a way that some mega alliance can be reached to get a deal that gets out of the European Union. I have no idea how realistic the prospects of success of those talks are. I don't know, for example, and Joe will know much better than I, whether or not if Mrs May were to agree to a deal that, for example, included a customs union, where that would lead to the Conservative Party setting upon her in such a way that she could never deliver it. Jeremy Corbyn's thought is he does not want to upset the Remainers in his party by facilitating Brexit, but he doesn't want to upset the Leavers by being adamantly against it.
Yeah, he's got a policy of constructive ambiguity, which is very clear. He's essentially leave in the north of England and remain in the south of England. That's basically how
break up of Great Britain.
How it's going, and it's working.
I agree with that, which is that you've got a choice between that or total paralysis on the other hand.
But this is what's so terrifying, really, and I'm not really a politician. I'm a business person who happens to be a baroness, okay? These guys are talking the detail of the political infighting which is going on within the Westminster bubble. Unfortunately, none of our politicians who have any say in this Brexit deal have taken one iota of interest in what is actually the public interest, what is actually in the best interests of Britain. They're manoeuvring like crazy in relation to their own parties, to the possible splits, and in some cases to what their own personal position is as potential leaders or future prime ministers or whatever. What is fundamentally apparent is that the worst possible outcome for this is for UK, as economically at least, is that we leave the EU. The world at large has the most appalling view of ourselves. I sit on a number of international boards, and quite honestly, investment in the UK has pretty much halted. It has halted because of uncertainty. Even the UK businesses are not growing and not developing because, as the business people in this audience will know, the one thing that business can't deal with is uncertainty. Tell them what the situation is, tell them what they have to cope with, and they cope with it. Uncertainty, which is likely to go on for the next 2 years, even if we get some kind of a fudgy deal, which is the possibility, the strong possibility, it is damaging to the UK as a whole. It is damaging to the individual people who can't get jobs, or who can get the sort of half jobs. They are technically employed, but they don't work very many hours, and they still have to take social benefits because even though they're working full time. It is the minute you move outside London, you begin to see how the infrastructure of the UK has diminished in the last 2 years, how the high streets of the UK are impoverished, how there are more homeless people on the streets. It has been so much energy from the government has gone into this Brexit process that absolutely everything else which is going on in the UK has been hugely neglected. It's got to stop, and the question is, how long does this carry on? It's got to end very soon, otherwise the UK will be in a very dire position.
Howard, you have a very different vision of this unlocking opportunity being fantastic for business. How do you square that with what you've just heard?
Well, look, first of all, foreign direct investment is still twice as much in the UK as it is in Germany.
But it's crashed.
Secondly, as I said earlier, the GDP figures are not impressive, but are broadly in line with the rest of the Eurozone. I think Warren Buffett last week made the statement that he'd invest happily in the UK with or without Brexit. I mean,
in the exclusive FT interview, I should say.
I mean, maybe he's an ignorant investor, I don't know. But I mean, he made the point, of course, that we have a rule of law that he feels he can trust more than any other country other than the US, and that we have a culture that's more similar to the US than any other foreign market. We also benefit from, things like time zone, language, 5 of the top scientific universities in the world, etc., etc. So what's the opportunity for Brexit, and why do I think we can be better off by leaving if it's executed properly? Well, the structure of the UK economy is fundamentally different to the rest of Europe. We do have manufacturing, but we're largely a service-based economy. We're too London-centric at the moment. What I would do is deregulate. I would make us the Singapore of Europe. I would cut corporation tax. I would encourage foreign direct investment. And I would also encourage regeneration of regions that are depressed by subsidies and tax incentives that you are not allowed to do under current EU legislation. I would invest in infrastructure of the north. I would cancel HS2. I would do all sorts of things which an independent Great Britain could do. I would have been negotiating trade deals for the last 2 years. The EU rules that said you can't negotiate a trade deal while you're a member, why would you not negotiate during the period of transition? What was the sanction that the EU were going to impose if we'd started negotiating a trade deal in the meantime? It's all about a vision. If you're going to leave, if you're going to change, what are we good at in the UK? Bioscience, pharma, financial services, legal services, software, media. Focus on what we're good at and build what we're good at. But you've got to have leadership. We don't have leadership. We do not have leadership.
You've floated the upside of trade deals. The biggest of all, potentially, is with the US. We have President Trump coming for a state visit to Britain, June the 3rd to the 5th. Hugh, as first Secretary Political, that's a stressful time for you. But what will you be expecting out of that visit? Is this the moment that unlocks
on Brexit
a glorious new future of US-UK trade relations?
Well, look, the practical point is the UK is not going to be in a position by June to be launching or talking about a trade agreement with the US. It's just not going to be in a position to do that. warm words get you through a couple of news cycles, but they're not bankable. So I'm now behaving less like a first secretary at the U.S. Embassy and more as a former foreign policy advisor in Number 10. But on the longer term issue, if and when we do eventually come out of the EU, in the area of trade, and in particular financial services, I think that there is something in this idea, building on what Howard said, that what should emerge, and should probably emerge, is some sort of, how shall I put it, Anglo-Saxon caucus, in the sense of, in a world of people competing over setting standards and access rights and so on, there is a natural affinity of those, it's almost this sort of New York, London, Singapore, Hong Kong, Toronto, Sydney access, where they share interests and a vision, and that at least...
Except for chlorinated chicken.
Yes, except for chlorinated chicken. But, and that they should be forming a much more effective caucus in various international fora to be progressing and arguing the sort of common agenda, and that actually the US should now be planning to try and make something like that emerge.
Okay, we're getting into the last 7 minutes of this discussion, which means you each have I'll give you each a minute to answer this next question. Knowing where we are now, tell us what your vision of the best possible outcome is and how you get from here to there.
The politicians have got to gird their loins to get to a point that we can leave. Joe is right that there's a huge number of big policy issues that haven't been resolved by anybody or indeed addressed about the UK's economic, security, defence, counter-terrorism place in the world because of the extraordinary judder that comes from leaving the European Union. But we have to stop being in this obsessive political crisis. We will remain, once we have left the European Union, the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world, and there will be people who want to trade with us, and there will be things that we will do well. We as a country have been incredibly good over a long period of time of pragmatically taking advantage of our advantages. Our big problem at the moment is the political crisis that grips an unconfident political class. Denise is absolutely right that we need to end the uncertainty. My anxiety, and I'm a Remainer, I prefer to remain, my anxiety is if we had a second referendum and tried to refight that issue, the uncertainty would go on forever. We'd end up, if we voted leave in that referendum, to have intensified our split with the European Union and made ourselves look even more ridiculous. And if it was remain, there would inevitably be a third referendum and the uncertainty would go on. So end the political crisis. It may well involve a new Prime Minister. The new Prime Minister will go to Europe, get some cosmetically different looking deal. Parliament will pass it because Parliament cannot go on like this sort of quivering jelly. And then we'll spend the next 10 years sort of not talking about Brexit so much and resolving the issues pragmatically. And you should continue to invest in us because we will remain strong and we will remain just as good at commerce as we've always been.
I've been hoping for some good British mumbling where nobody quite understands what we're talking about, but not talking about it sounds good. It works in every British family.
Yes.
Talking of which, Joe, what's your vision of the best possible outcome now, and how would you get there?
Look, I think best is probably unattainable, frankly. I think Brexit is a challenge. I think we're not going to make progress until we know where we want to go. We can't leave the EU until we have a clear sense of what end state we want as a country for us. And it goes back to the choice which I set out in an earlier answer. Until we decide as a country sustainably what kind of relationship we want to the European Union and what kind of freedoms we would hope to achieve by leaving the European Union, we're not going to be able to just, as Lord Falconer said, just get on with it. There is no just getting on with it until you've taken that choice. And Parliament is at the moment, with its current composition, proving unable to deliver an answer. And until it can do that, then we're not going to make progress.
Okay, revoke, reflect, and remain.
How would
That's
you
what
do
I
that?
think. And I mean, that's the best way to do it. That's the ideal way to do it. Look, the Brits have this, they push things to the edge and then they say, oh, this looks like a mess, so let's not bother. And that's what I'm hoping will actually happen.
It's the can't be asked strategy.
Yeah, we just can't be asked to do this, actually. So let's just call it a day. That is what I'm hoping for. Whether it works, I don't know. But whatever happens, if we do have any kind of a deal, if my ideal doesn't happen, and we have any kind of a deal, we have got to give it a democratic stamp of approval or disapproval, and we have got to give the British public the opportunity to think again, because my God, now they know what it's about and how disastrous it will be. They have to have the opportunity to vote to remain, and that's what I want as a second best, because of my unachievable dream that they will all just say to hell with it.
You.
Just very quickly, I don't think there's much point in talking about ideal option. It's not on offer. Realistic options, I think Joe sets the bar far too high when he talks about consensus and clarity and so on. That's never going to happen either. So I'm much closer to Lord Falconer. I think the single most important thing is to try and get a decision and end the uncertainty. And of the options on the table, I would rank them in terms of some version of the May deal is preferable to a second referendum, which is preferable to an early election. Having said all that, I don't think any of that's going to happen. I think we're going to have more delay.
Right. How do you get to wrap it up?
Classic diplomat.
Well, Theresa May told us that no deal's worse than a bad deal.
No, the other way around.
Wrong about that.
No, other way around, she said. Other way around.
Bad deal's worse than a bad deal, sorry. She got that bit right. I don't agree that we should just accept something that we know is going to be a suboptimal deal. If we get change of leadership and we have a strong vision and a strong leader, they can go back to the negotiating table. And this is tactical, but we do have cards to play. We haven't played any of them. We've never threatened the Europeans with anything. They've threatened us all the time. We've never threatened them with anything. We never said we won't pay.
War?
We never said we won't give you access to... Can I finish? Sorry. Yeah. We never said...
We've got 30 seconds.
We never said we won't pay. We never said we won't give you access to our markets. We never said that we won't help you with other things that are important to them, that if we had more time we could go into. So strong leadership, vision, deliver a real Brexit, never give up.
Okay, final lightning round. You are allowed to pass. Who is the next leader of the Conservative Party? Starting with you, Howard.
Look, I think
In what, 2 words? Name.
any of the 5 major contenders, all of them would be much better than Theresa May.
Okay, you.
Civil servant, pass.
Want to take this one?
I haven't a clue.
It's a Grand National. I'm the only person not running.
Are you going to give us a name?
I think Boris Johnson or Michael Gove.
All right.
Good.
I suspect we'll have more to talk about Brexit in a year's time, so we'll see you all back here then. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.